One of my chief preoccupations lately has been the interiorization of social life, particularly in the United States, although, of course, as other countries sort of follow the United States in this or that respect, and especially given the events of 2020 and the years immediately following, this is something of a global concern. And what I mean by interiorization is that there has been a progressive movement toward the shrinking of what we might call common or shared or public space, and a concomitant expansion of private space, of the interior. And when I say progressive movement, I just mean a trend that is proceeded in steps. I don't mean to say anything about it ideologically. But this movement has taken place certainly over the past few decades. Arguably, it's been taking place for the whole of the history of civilization, but we'll get to that shortly. Before I do go any further, I want to point out that if we scratch at the surface of this, we find something deeper down that would seem to contradict everything I just said entirely, which is that from the perspective of, say, the 19th century United States, the typical American today really enjoys very little of private property. Property at that time was understood to have a certain moral dimension to it. The word would not have immediately conjured the image of, say, the vast holdings of some multinational corporation. Rather, property was something that enabled you to live freely, something that allowed you to truly exercise the rights of a citizen. And of course, in the very early United States, property was an explicit qualification for suffrage. And the exact qualification, the way it was defined, varied by state. But the idea there is that if you have your own land, your own tools, your own assets by means of which you and your family can live independently, then we can be assured that you will not be beholden to some outside moneyed interest that might sway your vote. Rather, presumably, your vote is going to reflect the exercise of your independent faculties. And as strange as it might sound to us today, there was a deep skepticism of wage labor in general in the early 19th century United States. And there was a skepticism, there was a concern that, for example, allowing unpropertied wage workers to vote might mean that they just vote the way the factory owner tells them to. So there was this ongoing concern as the franchise was expanded under Jackson, and again during Reconstruction. You may have heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule. There was an ongoing concern with, as we expand the franchise, also expanding the institution of proprietorship so that every man can vote. At the time it was every man can vote, and every man at least has a clear pathway to getting his own land, his own tools, and thereby the means by which he can truly be a citizen. So there was really this ideal of widespread, if not universal, small proprietorship. Now, we've obviously gone a very long way away from that ideal today. And yeah, I think from the perspective of some of the greatest minds of the 19th century United States, today's United States in its relationship to private property, to wage work, and so on would be quite appalling. Though on the other hand, we would of course be materially rich beyond perhaps their wildest imagination. And it's the way in which these riches are being deployed and enjoyed that I really want to talk about here, because there has been a remarkable shift toward, again, the sort of proliferation of private bubbles of use, bubbles of enjoyment. And what is shared is kind of this hollowed out husk. So, for example, you no longer have to go to a movie theater to see even a new movie. You can simply use a streaming service at home. You no longer have to go to a restaurant for prepared food or to a grocery store for food in grocery format. You can simply have these things delivered to your door. And when you do elect to go to the grocery store, you find that some people have headphones on so that even though their feet walk about in this shared environment, their ears refuse. Some part of them just refuses to take part. And of course, how do we get to the grocery store or the concert hall or the movie theater, whatever? We take a car in most of North America, which means once again we enter into a private sphere, a little individual pod, and we put on our own music or whatever. And then the car moves about in a space that is just shared by other cars. And so it's not necessarily meant to be enjoyed by humans sans car. And then, you know, we arrive at our destination and then we can walk around there. And of course, there's this strange defense of the car dependent lifestyle as a kind of emblem of cowboy individualism, even though, of course, it's just as dependent on modern supply chains as any other aspect of modern life. And on the other hand, a lot of people who claim to advocate greater walkability also advocate more or less for public disorder. So it's a real problem. The commons are abandoned to, if you like, the lowest common denominator, which motivates further retrenchment into the safe, cozy, comfy interior. And the interior continues to grow, and houses get bigger. And we have all these expectations of private space. Some people find it strange that small children should share a bedroom. You know, that's a demand and expectation of private space that would be, you know, very strange to someone before a few decades ago. And I guess that is a point that I do want to make, that the expansion of personal space to an extent is a process of millennia. If we look at if we look at early prehistoric dwellings, you know, the further back we go, the more likely we are to find shared spaces, communal dwellings, and also spaces that are not as differentiated in terms of their purpose. As civilization has developed, there have come to be more different kinds of spaces, and there have come to be a greater proliferation again of individual allotments of space and enjoyment and use. And to that extent, we can say that this is a very old trend, but more recently, I think we've taken it to a real extreme, and it seems to be making us unhappy, even as we might continue to opt for the interior version of something. It's clear that this social anticommons is failing to meet some need that we have, and it certainly creates a kind of ugliness. You know, there's that famous image of Breezewood, Pennsylvania, which I may use as the thumbnail for this video. Adam Van Buskirk pointed out on the site formerly known as Twitter that some try to discredit the Breezewood image by pointing out that it is actually set among fields and forests, but that makes it hit harder, epitomizes the entire vibe and dilemma of modern America. Shockingly ugly and shoddy works of man in a splendid natural landscape. And Tom Bombadil replied, "Unironically, I think this is what individualism and freedom look like. There's no top-down power, nor are there strong cultural norms that shape aesthetics. Aesthetics are thus moved inside, each person decorating their own home to their taste. The public sphere is stripped of aesthetic purpose and becomes purely functional, a place to run errands in. Individual establishments may craft their own aesthetic identities, but it's all indoors, so as to isolate it from the outside. Outside signage exists solely to be readable to drivers passing by at 40 miles per hour." And again, I want to call this a social anticommons. Anticommons being a term from Michael Heller, one of whose talks I'll link in the description. He contrasts the tragedy of the anticommons with the better-known tragedy of the commons. To quote everyone's favorite online encyclopedia, "The tragedy of the commons occurs when a resource has many users, none of whom own it, and thus none of whom have the ability to exclude others from using it, leading to the overutilization of that resource. The tragedy of the anticommons occurs when a resource has many owners, all of whom have the ability to exclude others from using it, leading to the underutilization of that resource." Now, Michael Heller, I think, he looks at situations in intellectual property law, for example, where this is a problem, and there are many such cases, but I'm applying it in this social sense. I think it's a very helpful concept. He makes the point, even in the talk that I'll link in the description, that at one time it might have made sense to have a concept of a spectrum where there was sort of full commonality, basically communism on one side, and fully fleshed out individual property rights on the other. And to put it in the terms that I'm concerned with here, with sociality, like this sort of pure communal sociality on one side, and fully fleshed out independent individuals on the other. But that spectrum doesn't really make sense. We probably need to think of the optimum as, in this case, as in many others, the median, somewhere between two extremes. And we may have to go quite far into the extreme of this this individualism, this anti-commons, before we can actually kind of come out the other side and come back to an agreeable middle. There may need to be some haggling about this, but that's really what I wanted to lay out here. At least introduce this concept of the anti-commons, the social anti-commons, the defection from shared space, the interiority, the increasing interiority of our experiences, which I think, again, is making us very unhappy, even as, the exact opposite would probably make us very unhappy as well. So that's about it for this video. Be seeing you.